Okay, so this will be we're going to cover really just chapters today, chapters 1, 2, and 3. And we're not going to get into the hatat, the sin offerings, and we'll talk about them as a purification offering, not as a sin offering. And there's reasons for that because it gives a better description. But today we're going to cover burnt offerings, grain offerings, and burnt offerings, grain offerings, and the Shiloh offering, which is the peace offering, also called by several different names, but we're going to call it Shiloh. And I think it's important as we go into this, we keep you guys learn the Hebrew name because every translation has a different name for something, and it creates confusion, and people don't know how to associate, maybe a fellowship with a vow or something like that. So I want to teach you guys the Hebrew word for the offering, so you always associate and keep the information under that. So I one of the words I want you to kind of learn is mizbech. That's the bronze altar. That's how it's referred to in Hebrew. And why I'm going to bring this up because I'm going to use the word mizbech, and you may not know that, but this is important. It's for the first 7 chapters. This is the cornerstone. This is what we're going to be covering. So you kind of need to know the word mizbech and the altar. We're going to later on. We're going to get into more specifics about layouts and processes. But for now, we're just going to keep it a top level, and then we're going to get a little deeper. And so the Hebrew word for sacrifice, as most of you probably already know, the word for sacrifice is korban. Its meaning is to draw near, or our word for sacrifice comes from the Latin, which means to make sacred. Okay. The act of sacrifice is a transference of property as a gift to God. And this idea of transference of our property as a gift, we're going to drill down and get more into that. The first thing that you learn from the sacrificial system is you don't have to come before a king empty-handed. In fact, if you come empty-handed, you won't be recognized. And this is important. Too many times we come, we call something the altar, we call something his tabernacle, his temple, but we come empty-handed. We don't come with something because we're coming forward to meet a king and to speak to a king. So this is kind of important that the word itself and how things are done then are going to teach us so much about how we draw near and how we approach God today. We have to bring our best. I don't think that's understood today in our culture. I think we have kind of lost that. And the idea of simply forgive me, I won't do it anymore, is not what was taught in Leviticus. Okay. The idea of teshuvah, to repent, to bring a gift, to atone, it incorporates not just words on your lips, but a change of heart, and also things that you're going to bring that you personally have, you're presenting to the king. So it's all part of it. Today we forgive me, Lord, and think that's it, but that's not what we are taught in Leviticus. And if I believe God's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, then we must glean from this relationship in Leviticus, how they drew near, and it's going to teach us so much. And you're going to see words of King David and Samuel and others we're going to talk about today that are kind of give us this idea. We see this clearly in the idea of Cain and Abel. Cain, he came, went through the motions, brought a gift, but it wasn't in his heart. He brought something that was defiled. Where Abel, he came, and I spelled his name wrong. He came, and Abel came, and he came with a humble heart, a tender heart. He came to bring his best, and that's why he was honored. So from the very beginning, we're taught this idea, and somehow that's been lost. Okay. In the pagan culture, sacrifices are brought as food for their gods. In other words, many of you here have been to some type of Asian restaurant, Vietnamese or something like that. And you walk in, I see it a lot in the Thai restaurants, and they have a tray or a plate they set aside with sometimes fruit, There's usually wine, a cup, and they got pictures. Sometimes they do it to their ancestors. Sometimes you'll see a picture of Buddha and things like that. So these pagan cultures have always had this idea that they bring something and it's going to be food for their gods, even though they throw it out the next day. In their minds, they've been taught culturally that they're there to feed the god. But we're going to teach this. That's not why we bring this, and we're gonna really get into this when we get into the peace offerings itself.
Oh, well, that makes me think of when kids leave cookies out for Santa.
Uh, that's exactly. I mean, that's
That
exactly.
makes it that just came to mind.
Let me just do something real quick. I'm gonna stop sharing this. Let me look at this PowerPoint and make sure.
Hey, Adriana.
Give me a second, guys. I know this is.
Hi, Betty. How are
I'm
you?
good. I haven't seen you in a while.
I know. I've been really busy with Hannah. She's she's really a handful, baby.
Boy, is she.
Is she?
Yeah, but she's sweet. Right now she's singing.
She's singing. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, she
She's
kept us
singing.
up to 4 o'clock in the morning last night. So she's off our Hanukkah card list. So.
No.
All right, so in Hosea we read this, and I hear a lot of preachers quote this scripture because a lot of times it's not in context. But let's take the heart of what Hosea is talking about, the 10 tribes, and keep in mind the many or most of the 10 tribes had discontinued going down to Jerusalem because it was legally against the law for them to do that, even though many still did it. They would go to Bethel and Tel Dan and other places to bring their offerings, and they had their own priests set up, and so there was a lot of disconnect with the northern kingdom and the way they did business. But the prophets were still trying to get them to get to the heart of the matter, and we read here in Hosea 14 verse 2. Can everybody see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It says, "Return, O Israel, to Adonai your God, for you have stumbled in your iniquity. Take words with you and return to Adonai." Notice this is take words, okay, with you. Why is he saying this? Well, in context, they're not going to Jerusalem. So God doesn't want them to, he does not want them to bring offerings to Bethel where they got a golden calf sitting there, or to Tel Dan where they golden calf. So when he's talking about them, when they're drawn near, he wants them to come with a true heart on their lips with the words. Take words with you and return to Adonai. Say to him, take away all our iniquity and accept what is good. And this idea of what is good is an offering that's not defiled, a heart that's not defiled, an intention that's not defiled. So we may repay with offerings of our lips. And notice how it says that. So today, as we live outside of the land where there is no altar, there is no temple, this is the intent of God when we draw near, for him to take away the iniquity, take away the sin, our backsliding. We must come with intent on our lips, and we must draw near. And this summarizes the whole original understanding of how God wants us to approach him. Okay. Notice what is required: the sacrifice, a sincere heart, and words of our lips. Is the only way we can really draw near today, with a sincere heart and just words on our lips. And this is very, very important. How many have been taught that if you just say a prayer in your mind, it's good enough, right? Who've been taught in the past? Well, according to the sages, you do not do that. When you say a prayer, you move your lips. And they get this from Hannah in First Samuel. She spoke, and Eli thought she was drunk because she was moving her lips and not saying anything, but she came with it on her lips and she was speaking it. So the sages says this was the intention of God, that we always speak our prayers either out loud or we speak them on our lips, even if it's in our prayer closet or in a private place. We must always move our mouth and say it because it's more with intention. Okay. I think I learned this a few years ago, and it really changed the way I pray, because a lot of times you just do it in your head and it's not coming out of your heart when you're just saying things inside of your mind. Now, if you're in a place where you can't do this, you can't speak it, and then you don't want people to think you're crazy, that's a different issue. Driving down the road and people just see you moving your mouth, they may think you're on your phone or your Bluetooth, so it doesn't make a difference today. But the most important thing is you say it with it on your lips, and you move your lips. Okay. For the Israelite then and for us today, our king was accessible, but humility and sincerity was and will always be required for us to draw near. Okay, one of the uniqueness of the Israelite priesthood versus the pagan priesthood, we're going to do this throughout the book of Leviticus. We're going to draw contrast back and forth, because that's even though we don't see this today, it was very real to them, and so in context, when Moses is teaching the proper ways, he's doing distinctions from the way the nations around went around their religion. Okay, even modern priesthood is that it was hereditary by nature. And the fact that one tribe was picked out of a nation, all right, and one clan out of that tribe, and then within that clan itself, one specific family was going to be a high priest position, and one clan would serve in the priesthood, and so it was hereditary. When the Northern Kingdom broke away, hey, any volunteers? Raise your hand. You want to be a priest? You. Okay, there wasn't a calling. It wasn't a professional priesthood. Today in the Catholic priesthood, we say the same things. People say, I got a calling, or they have a tragedy in their life. They decide to do a vow of abstinence and they join the priesthood. But there's no professionalism in the way it was designed from Mount Sinai. And this is a distinction that we see from the nations, that anybody could get into it. Now, I've read in many books about pagan priesthoods. It was considered a high honor among a tribe or a nation to be part of that priesthood. And if you were considered part of the elite. And this was the problem in Egypt, and how when God asked them to wear tzitzit, it was to give them the same status as a priesthood, to make them feel like they were important. Where in the Egyptian priesthood, and it was elitist. They owned property, they had power, and they lorded it over the people themselves. And they were never really understood the processes and procedures that would go on in their pagan temples. Contrary, the system here is taught to everyone. Everyone was to learn it, even though somebody in the tribe of Naphtali could never be a priest or a high priest. They still understood the process and how they would take place.
So
Does everybody understand?
In the pagan religion, did they allow women to be priests?
Yeah, see, that's another distinction we're going to get into in the next chapters, and I will tell you, and I think that there was places in the temple for women to serve. Okay, we see this in with Anna. We see her when she saw Yeshua, and she had been waiting on him. So she was a prayer warrior, an intercessor. So there was places at the temple for them, but it was in the outer courtyard or outside of that specific space. But as far as inside the inner courtyard, there was no place for that. And there's even restrictions for a prince. So if you're, let's say, for example, you're a son of King David, you could never come in. You can never come until you are anointed king of Israel. You can never step foot in the inner courtyard. And only King David or those who are anointed, the Mashiach of the nation, would be able to actually get on the steps, but none of his family members. So there was very, very clear distinctions about roles. And we're going to talk about King Uzziah and some of the things where he crossed. That he crossed over and did something that he was not allowed to do, and God immediately struck him. Okay, so in a good question, Betty. In a non-Levitical priesthood, anyone could serve. One of the first things the Northern Kingdom did under Jeroboam I was they established their own priesthood, and so they took volunteers. Eventually, what happened with that is you didn't have a professional priesthood, and it began, and as Baal and Asherah worship began to penetrate the walls of the Northern Kingdom, what happened was they began to no longer know what's clean and unclean, what was common and from the clean. They did not understand how to teach the people the difference, and so it was completely lost. Okay, the advantage of a Levitical system was a professionalism from generation to generation. So, as an example, from the age of 5, early on, sons and daughters of Levites are taught scripture, the Torah. They're taught to memorize this. They would study to the age of 20. From when they would become part of that, if they were in the choir, they were going to be in the one of the singers, or they were the priests themselves. From 20 to 30, there was an apprentice time where they apprentice into the priesthood, and then at age 30, they would all begin to serve in a full role. And then at 50, they would quit serving the primary role, but they would go into teaching roles. So you can see that from almost the early age, somebody within that tribe was already beginning to learn the profession of serving God at a very high level. And this is very different than any other nation, and it's never been there. We've never found anything like this in any nation or any other type of religion. Doesn't mean there wasn't corruption, and corruption did creep into it, and we saw that with Eli and his sons, but God quickly corrected it. Malachi, the book of Malachi, is all about correcting the corruption in the priesthood. So yes, there comes from generation, you can get a corrupted priesthood, but God constantly was refining them and bringing them through and trying to get them to be better. In the first century, they had completely become corrupted and, in my opinion, unredeemable. Nobody was willing to change and repent, and because they were corrupted so much by money and power, that in my opinion, that was a primary reason for the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Now, if you can remember King Uzziah, what did the priests do? They drug him out because he tried to put his own incense on the altar of incense. It says 80 to 90 men, priests, were trying to attempt to get the king out of there. And this guy must have been pretty strong. He was determined, but clearly he was cut off from the people because of his what he had done. Does everybody remember that story? Okay. All right. So we've seen this 1,000 times. By the way, I just want to, we're going to get into this. Obviously this would be considered the inner courtyard from here. This would be the outer courtyard. It would change in the temple. But truthfully, this is all the inner courtyard right here. Okay. Bronze altar. From further studies, they've always placed the copper bronze basin here. It actually was over here, close to an entrance of another tent, because they could not come into the tabernacle. That one of the commandments was they could not come into the inner courtyard until they had washed their hands and feet. So it had to be close to the side. But this is now this was the entrance of the tent of meeting, and we're going to hear a lot about this threshold. This threshold is super important in the offerings that are being brought. So remember this here. So from the bronze altar to the threshold, there's 30 cubits. Which is roughly about 45 feet, 40, 50 feet, okay, between that. So if somebody brought an offering, let's say, of anyone, and once they gave it to the priest, they would clearly see the priest putting it on, cutting it into the 8 pieces and then putting it on the altar. They could see what was happening to their altar and during the tabernacle time. Later on, after Emadu Jerusalem, it was very hard for you to see what was happening with your own altar, with your own sacrifice.
Robert,
yes.
Question. Just thinking through the logistics of that and the size of the nation, even when this was just the tent of meeting, I guess all the way up until the time of David, until Solomon in the first temple. But how many priests would be serving on any given day, and how many animals would be sacrificed? And I'm thinking that 45 feet, that might be pretty small if you've got 1,000 animals coming through that day, just moving them through the process.
So just look at it. Let's say they've seen from the Mishnah, from accounts, and also in the Talmud, that during the first century, they would have upwards of 1 to 1.5 million sacrifices during Passover. So when a cohort came in, you know, we remember those, they were broken down in 24 cohorts. Okay. So when they would come in, they would be there for a 2 week period. And in that 2 week period, they would wake up early in the morning, about 4 o'clock, 4:30. They'd be woken up, be prepared at 5 to start their jobs at daybreaks when everything began. But you would have hundreds of priests, you know, in position to do so. And that applies even at Mount Sinai, because if you look back at the numbers of the priests at that time, remember they had to give a gift. It was a tithe. It was like 223 because there was 22,300 priests that were in the Kohath family. So even though there was only Aaron, his sons was limited, the entire Kohath clan was involved in this process and helping process this. So there was plenty of help, but they had to be very, very efficient. And a sacrifice, once they brought the animal in, it would take literally about 45 seconds to go through that whole process. It was that quick. It's amazing how fast it is. It's a really good question. All right, so some of the questions we want to talk about today is we're going to talk about burnt offerings. I want you to learn the Hebrew word for each one of these sacrifices. But one question was, what was the purpose of the olah? And that's the burnt offering. What was one of its purposes? And this is really, really important because we see burnt offerings that had been offered by Noah. He offered a burnt offering. We see a burnt offering by Samson that wasn't on the altar. So there's been burnt offerings. So we got to understand what was the purpose of that burnt offering. And it's very specific. Okay. How many types of burnt offerings were allowed? We're going to get into the numbers and describe each one of them. We're going to talk about how God did not discriminate on a burnt offering because he wanted his entire nation to draw near him. So there was no discrimination based on the money that you had. So if you brought a male bull as a burnt offering, which would probably cost in today's numbers, today's dollars, would be $1,100 to $1,500. That's an expensive thing. So most people in our neighborhoods where we live could not afford to bring something like that. So we're going to go into the categories and talk about that. Last, what were the items that were never allowed to be placed on the altar and the why behind that? Oh, so first question I asked was what was the purpose of the olah, burnt offering? As we discussed last week, the olah, the burnt offering, would precede all other offerings. It would be the first that would be brought in place. So even if somebody was going to bring a sin or a trespass offering, it would be preceded by a burnt offering. And I'll explain why here in a minute. We're going to look here in Malachi 1:6. It's kind of teaches about intent. Verse 6. It says, but you say, how did we despise your name? And in verse 7 it says, by offering defiled bread on my altar. But you say, how did we defile you when you say the table of Adonai is despicable? And by the way, this is important, this use of the word table, shulchan. That word table is symbolic. Obviously, the bronze altar or the altar itself it's not the table of God. We weren't like the pagans, but it's used symbolically as a table when they were brought. Okay. Verse 8, when you bring a blind one as a sacrifice, is it not wrong? Or when you bring a lame or sick one, is it not wrong? Offer them now to your governors. In other words, go to the governor of your tribe, and would he be pleased with you, or will he acknowledge you favorably, says Adonai Sebaot. Now, so what he's saying in Malachi 1 is if you're coming to me with a burnt offering, this is the beginning of the conversation and the relationship. So if you're starting the conversation, Lord, please forgive me. I'm coming with a Thanksgiving offering, but I'm going to bring something that's wounded or it's damaged or something that's got some type of mange or some disease. Is that what you think of your God? Okay, so what he's describing here is the intention of how a relationship starts. And if your relationship starts with bringing whatever you see fit, then obviously you don't know how to draw near the Lord. That's what Malachi is talking about. So over and over, judgment would be brought on the olah, or burnt offerings. It would be refused, if you will, because of someone's insincerity, false pretenses, or just going through the motions. And we keep all three of those in mind when we go into prayer today before our God. Are we being sincere? Is there false pretense? Are we manipulating a relationship? Right? Are we just going through the motions because that's what we're supposed to do? You know, everybody calls a day of prayer, so we go through the motions, but we're not doing it with the sincerity. So the burnt offering is about opening a relationship up. It's about being sincere, and it cannot come with false pretenses. Look at it another way. You're drawing near the King of the universe, okay? So think about this. Esther and Artaxerxes. Esther prepares for 3 days, right? She fasts for 3 days before she goes an earthly king. When she finally comes, if you go back and read in the book of Esther, she is in the outer courtyard. She draws near and comes to a threshold. Those who are ministering the king tell the king about it, and then he lowers his scepter and allows her to come inside the inner courtyard. It's a drawing near process, right? But her life was at stake. If he decided to refuse her presence, then she could have been, because of the laws of the Persians, she could have been killed. Now think about it. This is just an earthly king. And what I'm getting at here is this is the heavenly king, the one who's created the entire universe. And when you're drawing near, you've got to have the mindset as Esther. I need to prepare for this moment. And that's what the burnt offering is teaching. How do we draw near with the proper intention and heart? All right. Does everybody understand that or have any questions about that? Okay. So just kind of a summary on that. The burnt offering is the initiation of a relationship with the Lord. Okay. That's how I want you to think of the burnt offerings and what its purpose and why we do that. So how many types of burnt offerings were allowed? So we're going to talk about from verse 3 of chapter 1, we see that from the cattle, so from the bulls, so we take a male without blemish, he'd be 1 to 3 years old. Now, it doesn't say that in the written Torah, but in the oral Torah, we know they had to be between 1 to 3 years old. Okay. And so the price on something like this, I was explaining earlier, is, it's over, in today's dollars, it'd be well over 1,000. I have a friend of mine in Oklahoma that I know that she raises bulls for rodeos, and she tries to get, depending on the bull and how it's trained, to go to a rodeo, she could get upwards between $2,000 to $5,000 for a bull. Okay. So remember, this is the top of the line of the offerings that you're being bringing. So there's a higher price that goes with it. But the second degree would be a sheep or a goat, and from the flock. It had to be male in every case for the burnt offering, 1 to 3 years old, and we find that in verse 10. These two were the primary required burnt offerings. Keep that in mind. Number 1 and 2 are the primary required. Anything less than this would have to be socioeconomic for you to use anything but those two. Okay. Number 3, a turtle dove.
The sheep and goats are worth $250 to $450.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I was going to bring that up. Good point. That's exactly right. So you can see like 1,000 to 250, and then as we go down to a turtle dove, I was researching it one day, and you can get a really beautiful turtle dove for about $75, and it can be downwards about $40 to $50 a typical turtle dove. So, and that would be the next one. And it's interesting about they say a turtle dove or a pigeon. A pigeon had to be very young. You could not use a pigeon that was over 2 or 3 years old, because a pigeon tends to become wild, and so it would not meet the requirements because of its wild status, and it become defiled. And it's interesting because so you have a sheep and a goat. So a sheep is more calm, and it's an animal that doesn't cause a lot of problems, where the goat will cause problems as it gets older, it gets more capricious, right? Well, and the same thing with the turtle dove, it's a very tame animal, but the pigeon, on contrary, as it gets older, becomes more wild in nature. And I find the contrast between the sheep and the goat and the turtle dove and the pigeon kind of interesting. Now, you wouldn't know that, but you'd have to go into the oral Torah to understand that, and they would talk about how a pigeon would act. But a turtle dove or a pigeon would be allowed if the person, and we see this in verse 14, if they didn't have the means to do the first two. And then finally, the last one that, and keep in mind, when you read Leviticus chapter 1, it goes into chapter 2 and gets into the grain offering here. It really should, if they actually had done this properly, they would have taken chapter 2 and the first 3 verses and made it part of chapter 1, because the grain offering that's specified there is part of the burnt offering process. Okay, so in the grain offering here, as a replacement, if you did not have the means, this is the various lowest level of burnt offering that somebody could come, it still required olive oil and frankincense. It still required that. And I don't know what the dollar amount of all of that would be back then. Obviously, frankincense is not more prevalent in the Arabian Peninsula, so compared to bringing it through, our capitalistic society, so it's more expensive. But back then, it was a lot more economical. Now, you see this in chapter 2, verse 1. So a grain offering could be allowed for somebody who is extremely poor and had no means or access to these other animals. Okay, and this kind of tells the socioeconomic of the different. So I basically call somebody dirt poor to bring this burnt offering. Okay. Now we're going to give you an example of this. If you look here into Luke chapter 2, verse 21, and I'm going to explain this, but this is part of an offering that's being brought, and it says here, this is Joseph and Miriam, or Mary, as we know her. It says, verse 21, when the 80 days had passed since the Brit Milah, which is since circumcision. So the way it works for the period of purification, if a mother has a son, the entire period of purification is 40 days. So you have the 7 days, and then 7 days in the beginning, first part of the first phase, then they're circumcised, and then you have an additional 33 days for a total of 40 days. Okay, and then the mother could bring a purification offering. When you had a daughter, okay, it doubles up, so you have a total of 80 days. Okay, you follow me on this? So in this case, when the 8 days had passed for his circumcision of Yeshua, he was named Yeshua on that day, and the name given to him by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when the days of their purification were fulfilled. So when you read that, most Christians have no idea what that means. You're going to have to go to Torah to understand the time period that's involved here. So after the 40 days, then they would draw near and bring an offering before the Lord. According to the Torah of Moses, they brought him to Jerusalem to present to Adonai. This is drawing near, korbaning. As it is written in the Torah of Adonai, every firstborn male that opens the womb shall be called holy to Adonai. So they offered a sacrifice according to what was said in the Torah of Adonai, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Now, notice here, this is very interesting. If you go back, if I go back to here, Leviticus doesn't define whether it was 2. In verse 14, it doesn't tell us it's 2. Okay, we know in other places it does say that, but when it's explaining the offering itself, it doesn't tell us that. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because this is where you have the distinction of a written Torah and an oral Torah. Okay, they know what was written in the Torah of Moses. It states right there in Luke, right? But they also know what was understood, what to bring by oral Torah. So both of them kind of work side by side when they're drawing near. Leviticus 1:14, as I said before, doesn't tell us that they needed 2 turtle doves. So you'll see in the actions, in the prophets, and the writings, it further defines it. Here's important to note that Joseph and Mary are living in the area of Bethlehem at this time. All right. So them bringing turtle doves doesn't necessarily indicate their social economic status. It doesn't necessarily indicate it, but I want to bring something up here. The wise men hadn't brought their gifts. Okay, follow me here. Follow me. The wise men hadn't brought the gifts. So their socioeconomic is on the lower tier within Israel itself. So this would be a lower middle class. Okay. Once the wise men bring the gifts, their socioeconomic status changes immediately. Right. But that doesn't happen for almost, it's going to be a couple of years before the wise men will show up in Jerusalem. Contrary to what they tell in the Christmas story, they didn't happen at one time. So what happened in this period of time was 40 days after the birth of Yeshua. Okay. Does everybody follow me on that one? Now, the reason why I'm bringing these up and showing you this is because we need to make the connections between Leviticus and the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah. Make the connections when we read about these sacrifices being brought in the first century in the writings, we understand how they connect back to what they're doing. All right, so Leviticus 1:3 teaches us one thing is about personal responsibility. It says here in verse 3, if his sacrifice is a burnt offering for the herd, he is to present a male without blemish. And without blemish require to know that something doesn't have a blemish requires what?
Knowledge of the animal, that you have to be intimate with the animal. It has to be something that you own and you've been watching.
That's right. So if you use money, right, you turn money in for the sacrifice, right? We're going to talk about that later on in Leviticus. The person responsible must also be responsible for making sure there's no blemish either, or blood is on their heads. Okay, so it's important that if you're going to, and I would probably that Joseph and Mary were not they were not raising turtle doves. Okay, I'm pretty sure they weren't. Okay, so they had to purchase it. So when they went to purchase it, the person who was raising the turtle doves for this, most likely Levites were doing this. The Levites themselves had to know that it could not have a blemish. You couldn't have a broken leg or a wing or something like that in order to do so. And so not only is it your responsibility if you're going to buy it to inspect it, because once you change money, you own the responsibility there. You own it. So, but it also, if it is your animal, then you have to go through that inspection. So there is as Tyler said, a personal responsibility. He is to offer it at the entrance of the tent of meeting so that he may be accepted. And that word accepted is, who's going to accept it? Well, the priests themselves have a responsibility, but at the end of the day, the priest can't look down into the person's heart. Only God can do that. So if it's truly going to be it's going to be accepted by the Lord, then it must be a heart. The heart is being measured as they draw near. He is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, so it will be accepted for him to make atonement on his behalf. So notice here, twice the word accepted is mentioned in it. So that tells me that the emphasis that Moses is trying to bring to Israel is, you need to take your time, right? If you're going to do this, if you're not going to bring something, if you're going to bring something that has a blemish, or you're not going to be sincere about it, then you might as well not do it. Just stay home, right? Don't even draw near. But if you are, then you got to go through the process of making sure it's correct. So a big part of the burnt offerings is the acceptance itself. And as I mentioned earlier, for Artaxerxes to allow his wife Esther to draw near, there had to be an acceptance process that takes place there. Secondly, he is intimately involved in the slaying of the animal. We're going to talk about the laying hands on it, but just to tell you, the scripture itself is very clear that when you bring that animal, guess whose knife is being used? The knife, the Levite will give them the knife, but the person who brings the animal is going to use the knife itself. The priest does not cut the animal. All right, so this requires a different mindset, right? A very different mindset. City boys who never handle animals may be squeamish about it, but this is something that makes it personal, when you're personally involved in it and you're personally bringing it there, and then you can see them cut up the pieces and put them on the altar, your whole mind is, this offering started when I thought it, I picked it out, I inspected it, I drew near, and I personally was involved in this. And that's a big deal. Today we don't associate it because offerings are sacrifice, and it's completely distant from our mindset. Third, the laying of the hands on it. This is to me is really, really interesting. Okay. You're laying only one hand. The difference between laying a hand or laying hands has to do with personal responsibility. So what Moses is trying to, and he mentions it many, many times through every single offering. When you lay your hand on it, personal responsibility. When you lay your hands on it, like they do, like's laid on the scapegoat, right? That goes out. The priest will lay hands on that. Or in the New Testament, in healing, when you're laying hands on, the difference between one hand and two hands is, one hand is you're responsible. Okay. It's your act. You're the one who's drawn near. When it's two hands, you're only a vessel. The priest is a vessel where God has forgiven the sins of the nation, right? And he's casting out their sins to Asherah. The priest who does the laying hands is the vessel. He has no idea if God is going to forgive the nation that year or not. Now we know how by the scarlet, the scarlet thread turning white. We know that's some indications of it. But the truth is, the priest doesn't know by the lay hands, because he's just purely the vessel. The same thing applies when you're praying for healing and you lay hands. Your hands are just vessels, because you don't heal, God heals. You guys get the difference? And why I'm making this point, because I think a lot of times is we see, well, what's the difference? Hands. No, I think we need to know kind of how this all works. Any questions? All right, pretty straightforward. Okay, good.
Yeah.
I put this as huge. For me, it's huge. So because when you realize how intimate this process was compared to the nations, it's not dysfunctional. It's a very real thing. Okay. All right. So now let's go from the burnt offerings to the grain. Any have questions on the burnt offerings? Okay, we'll just go right into it. All right. So there's two kinds of grain offerings. Does everybody know what they are? As far as types of agriculture produce that are used, what are the two agricultural produce they use for grain offerings? What'd you say, Betty?
Wheat and barley?
There you go. Wheat and barley. Barley is done during the springtime, wheat later on. But a grain offering could actually be done any time of the year, because what happens is when they have grain, they store it so it can be used at any point during the year. Okay. All right. There are 13 grain offerings, and the word for grain offering is mincha. Everybody say that with me, okay? Mincha.
Minha.
There you go. You got to say the chet sound, the mincha. There's 13 grain offerings that were brought into the temple. Of these 13, 11 of them were without leaven. The other two had leaven. Okay. Of these two, you had the Thanksgiving offering, or the Todah offering, and then you had the wave offering of Shavuot, or for Pentecost. Okay. But that being said, neither one of those offerings would ever be cooked and placed on the altar itself. Okay. They were cooked outside of the courtyard, the inner and outer courtyard. There's ovens where they would cook them, and specified that were purified, and they had a process. They'd make them, they would be kosher. And once they were cooked, then they were brought in. But those two were never brought into the inner courtyard. As close as they would come would be the threshold between the outer courtyard and the inner courtyard. So when the temple was built, during the tabernacle, they would just come to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and that's where it was presented. But once the temple was built, there was an entrance on the north side of the outer courtyard where they would come in. There was a threshold where they would meet the priest, and they would go through the process, and then it was cooked, and then that would be shared with the priest at that point. Okay, but keep in mind, no leaven could ever be on the altar itself. The pagan nations would, but the Lord made sure that there was never leaven on the bronze altar. The pagan nations would offer leaven, honey, and many things that are specified it was unclean, and they didn't have a problem. But on the Mizbech, which is the word for altar I mentioned earlier, that they could never be leaven on it, and we're going to talk about the why. As you begin to learn more and more about sacrifices and the temple process, you'll see that God went to great lengths to keep the Levitical priesthood very distinct from appearing like the pagan temples, to great lengths. I mean, Betty, you mentioned earlier that the women could not be involved in it. And does anybody know why women could not be involved in the priesthood?
No.
So to put it very succinctly, and in the priestesses that were involved in the pagans' shrines and their temples were involved in harlotry, okay, or fornication. So in every single case, when they officiated, there was sexuality involved in it, and that's the primary reason why it was never allowed in women were allowed into the priesthood, the Levitical priesthood. That's the number one reason. Didn't mean they're wives and the virgins that were daughters of the priest didn't have responsibilities, and someday we'll talk about some of those responsibilities. But for the sake of understanding the difference, that was one of the main distinctions that God made sure that they did not even look remotely like them. Okay.
Have you seen the Catholic nuns that are now making themselves priests?
Yes.
I don't think the nuns are making them priests.
They are now.
Yeah, they are. They're becoming priests, and they're ordaining themselves, and even priests, the male priest are ordaining them.
Yeah.
So
they're deviating from every norm possible. But keep in mind, closer we get to the time of the return of the Lord, the Catholic Church will look more like the pagan Babylonian, Mesopotamian religions, and less like Christianity.
That's when the priests will be looking like nuns.
Yeah. Well, especially in the Lutherans and Episcopalians. All right. So it's interesting here in chapter 2 of Leviticus, as you can read, there, like I said, there was 13 mentioned. 4 are mentioned here. You had the grain offering that I mentioned in the beginning, that was associated with the burnt offering, where you had to bring wheat or barley with frankincense and olive oil. Okay, and that was described in the first 3 verses. But when you get then right after, I think it's verse 5 or 6. Let me check that real quick. Let me see. Right here, and yeah, as we get into no, I'm sorry, let's go back here. Yeah, chapter 2. Yeah, verse 4. In verse 4, you have a grain offering that specifically it's baked in an oven, and that oven, like I mentioned before, is not in the inner courtyard. It's outside. It's baked and then brought in, but they're designated ovens for this. And it says in verse 4, the grain offering is baked in the oven. It shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, unleavened wafers anointed. Okay, I want to bring this one up because when you read in I guess it's in Hosea, the father of Gomer is called Diblaim, okay, and his name means turned over raisin cakes. And he said, well, that's a weird name. Who would call their son turned over raisin cakes? All right, so what Baal did is these leavened raisin cakes were presented at their altars. Okay, it had raisins in it that would fermented. You had you leaven in the cake itself, and you're going to read about these raisin cakes all through the prophets are going to talk about these things. All right. So this is one of the things that the Baal worship entailed. And this is why when you look at these kind of this offering, it was without leaven whatsoever. Then you see in verse 5, 6, they had a third one is called a grain offering that was baked in a covered pan. It had a different purpose. It should be made of fine flour with oil. So this one didn't have frankincense. Neither the number 2. These 2 were without frankincense, but they were for other purposes. And then finally, the fourth one mentioned in this chapter is the grain offering of first fruits. And I don't spend a long time going into this. We may in another time, but there was a process where they would use what's called the memorial portion. How many read about the memorial portion? Okay. So the way it worked is you would take a handful in a hand like this, and then from that you take a memorial portion, and that was what was placed on the altar with the frankincense and the oil, the memorial portion. The other was separated out, and then that was what the priest would eat. Okay, but the memorial portion was taken out of the hand. It's basically a hand breadth wide of, or like from about 4 inches of grain that was taken. And then from that, a memorial portion was cut. So when you read the memorial portion, it's basically a tithe of the portion that's being given. Do you guys understand that? Okay. And so there was a process. They probably even, and I would be surprised if they had a special type of cup that was designated for that memorial portion. So they would get it down to an exact amount. Hope this guys, this is not boring to you. I know we're going to be running out of time here in a minute, but as we said earlier, these mincha or grain offerings could not have leaven on or honey, as we mentioned, and there was a distinction between the pagan temples. Here's the question: why? See, according to Jacob Milgram, he says that the arch symbol of fermentation, deterioration, and death is what leaven's about. It begins a process of deterioration. Okay, where we see it, see the bread rising, we think, well, oh yeah, it's becoming full, but it's a process of deterioration. This is why the wine libation or the wine offering is always thrown on the side of the altar, but never on the altar. You guys remember that?
Oh,
it's always on that north. It'd be on the northeast side of the altar. Here we're going to read here in Matthew 5 verse 13. The other thing was salt. So as opposed to what was not prevented, fermentation, salt was required on this. And in Matthew 5 verse 13, it says, "You," a reference to the apostles, "are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but not to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." So every single grain offering always had salt on it. That's why on Shabbat, when you guys offer, when we say the prayer over our challah bread, we place a little salt on it, and the reason for that, it's memorializing what's going on in the temple. Okay, that whenever you place salt, it's always comes back into that idea. And then Matthew 5:17 says something very interesting. We've read this many times, but here's another context to look at it. "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For surely I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one title will be not by no means pass away from the law until it's fulfilled." So for this covenantal, by keeping Torah and by keeping the commandments, okay, you become the salt of the earth. Let's make the connection here. You become the salt of the earth, and by being that salt, okay, there's a permanency to it. It's an everlasting nature of Torah. As long as we are teaching and keeping the commandments, we are salt like the apostles are. We are preservative of the relationship between God and man. The minute we lose the salt in our lives, if salt disappeared in our lives, if we quit keeping the commandments, then the earth would basically be destroyed. There would be nothing that would tie us to the relationship of God. So that's why our responsibility as those who believe, we actually hold the fabric of the world together by keeping commandments of God. We become that salt. It's kind of a huge burden is when we think about it. So the grain or the mincha offerings were seen as a present to secure or retain goodwill. This is Milgram's kind of his idea. It's to retain that. It would always accompany the other meat offerings, such as the sin, the burnt offerings, and the trespass offerings. You could look at it as a meal that would maintain a relationship between Israel, the priests, and who are offering these very offerings, and the Lord. So this was a relationship that was involved in all of this. Okay. And so where the wine, the grain offering, and the meat that's being sacrificed, it's like a meal. Okay. It's relationship oriented. It's covenant related when we do this. A grain offering could also be offered by itself. As we mentioned earlier, Milgram states that this was a special concession to the very, very poor, and they could bring a grain offering, but this was not the norm. Okay. And the last, I'm going to finish with this. We got a few more minutes, is the peace offering or the Shalomim offering. The reason why I want us to all say Shalomim, because the translations of every Bible has a different name for this offering. So if you always know, you go to your Strongs and see it says Shalomim, you'll always keep this in context, okay? But chapter 3 in Leviticus chapter 3 verse 1, it says, now if his offering is sacrifice of fellowship offerings. Now notice that in this translation here, it calls it a fellowship offering, okay? But the Hebrew says Shalomim, okay? Which is how we translate the word peace. A fellowship offering, it is from the herd, whether male or female. Notice it allows for both. He is to offer one without blemish before Adonai. He shall lay his hand, again, notice they lay a hand, not hands, on the head of the offering and slaughter at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Then Aaron's son, the Kohanim, are to splash the blood around the altar. So I want you to picture this ceremony, this peace offering, as the priest and the Israelite acting together and building a relationship around the sacrifice. It's not just them going through the motions and taking it. They're actually going to sit down with the person bringing it and eat that offering later on as a family. And at that table, that priest who took that offering, his family can be there, as well as the family of the Israelite, whether it be from Naphtali or a sojourner who's attached. Anybody could be part of that, and they would be set a specific place in the tabernacle area. Later on in the temple, there was an area in the courtyard adjacent to the outer courtyard where they would eat it. So once it be presented, there was a designated time where they would meet there, and they would sit down and they would break bread, the grain offering and the Shalomim offering with the priest. And it's basically like a barbecue, and they would come together as one. And we're going to read some scriptures here. I'm going to read various scriptures to kind of define this, okay? The priest who performs the ceremony will then partake, the one who brought the peace offering, in a separate area, as I mentioned earlier. If heard this being called, some people call it the family barbecue. I know Ryan White, that's what he called it, the family barbecue. A designated space where someone would in covenant can eat with the priest and his family is designated, and they will spend time in fellowship. So this is actually a really cool offering because it's very unique. The Asham, the Hatat, sin offering, trespass offering, you would not do this. Whatever was sacrificed was given to the priest, okay? But in this case, you would join with them, okay? That's
what was the purpose of the peace offering? Why would you bring a peace offering?
Glad you asked, okay? Jacob Milgram, he calls them well-being offerings. That's how he calls them. That's the name he gives them. But there's basically three types of Shalomim offerings, as you can see here. There's a free will, okay? And I'll give you some verses for that. There's a vow, and then there's a thanksgiving. And we're going to break by scripture each one of these down. So in an example of a free will offering, if you read in context, if you go back and read chapter 27, you'll understand the entire context of the chapter. It says, verse 6, you are to build the altar of Adonai your God of whole stones, and you to offer up burnt offerings on it to Adonai your God. You are to sacrifice fellowship offerings and eat there. So this would be the priests and the Israelites come together. And notice what it says right here. I highlighted, and you will rejoice before Adonai your God. That word rejoice is used in a couple of different places. And you are to write on the stones all the words of this Torah very clearly. So when you read the before and the after, this is all part of the building and people they were bringing things. They're freely giving for the building of the tabernacle. That was what the process was going on. And so the idea of free will is at any point, if there was just great joy that you felt and you told your family members, let's go down to the temple. I want to bring a free will offering because God has so blessed us, and no other reason other than I just want to be in relationship with him and show my joy. This is what the free will would be about. Okay. The second example would be a vow. Okay. And we're going to see here in First Chronicles chapter 29, verse 9, it says, and this is a relation with King David and the people. He says, and the people rejoice over their free will offerings because with a whole heart they offer willingly to Adonai. King David also rejoiced with great joy. Okay, now if we go back to Deuteronomy, it says they will rejoice with Adonai your God. So there's the word joy involved here. We come here to First Chronicles 29, verse 9. The people rejoice over their free will offerings because with their whole heart they offer willingly to Adonai. King David also rejoiced with great joy. So we could almost call this peace offering the joy offering, because that's what it was. It was a time to celebrate. There was an excitement. There was in the air, and people they were completely blessed. And then I wanted to show the rest of this because I think the context of this prayer is huge. To me, this is huge because we say this. You're going to see this, the Hebrew portion. It says, David blessed Adonai for the whole congregation, saying, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu leIsrael Abba leolam vayed. You see that right there? It's basically our entire, the words that we use in our prayer right there. Yours, Adonai, is the greatness, the power, and the splendor, and the victory, and the majesty. Indeed, everything in heaven and earth, yours is the kingdom, Adonai, and you are exalted above all. Both riches and honor come from you. You rule over everything. In your hand is power and might. In your hand to magnify and give strength to all. Now, our God, we give you thanks and praise your glorious name. If I ever heard a preacher give that prayer, I would be awestruck. That's a serious prayer right there. But you can see in the beginning, how does he start? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu. That's how he starts out this prayer, which is pretty cool. All right, and that's a second example of a free will offering. Now here's a vow offering. We'll look in Jacob in chapter 28 of Genesis, verse 18. He says, early in the morning, Jacob got up and took a stone which he had placed by his head and set up as a memorial stone. And what he did is he had a stone that he found. He wrapped it with he wrapped it so it'd be soft. He could put his head on it. And then he had the dream that night. He was so awestruck by the dream. He said that, this place is blessed. And so he took that stone and he made a memorial stone. So he took stacked stones and he stacked them up. And we've seen images of those. The memorial stone was placed on top. And then what he would do, he poured oil on top of it. Okay. And he called the name of the place Bethel. And though originally the city's name was Luz. And then Jacob made a vow saying, if God's will, this is an if-then vow. Remember, all vows is like a covenant. If God will be with me and watch over me on the way that I am going and provide me food to eat, clothes to wear, and I return in shalom and peace to my father's house, then Adonai will be my God. So this is if he does this, then he'll be my God. So this stone, which I set up as a memorial stone, will become God's house. And of everything you provide me, I will definitely give a tenth of it to you. Okay. So this is part of that vow that he's been making in this offering. And then we also see, if you read, guys, take the time today, if you can, just quickly read Acts 21. We have a shalomim, a vow offering being made by Paul and the 4 people that he paid for it. And you want to read it because that's about 20 years after Yeshua passed away, before the temple was destroyed. Paul and the believers were still making these vow offerings on the altar. This was commonplace. Okay. And we'll talk about that as we get toward the ends of Leviticus. And then finally, that there's a Thanksgiving offering. And according to the rabbis, they said that the definition of the Thanksgiving, remember, all three of these are Shalomim offerings, but they're broken into three categories: free will, vow, and here be a Thanksgiving offering. And in Psalms 107, it defines exactly why you would bring a Thanksgiving offering. Let's start off in verse 4. Some wandered in a desert, a wasteland, and they found no way to inhabit a city. They were lost. Okay. Hungry and thirsty, their souls ebbed away. So they cried out. That word "they cried out" is a legal term in scripture. So they cried out to Adonai in their distress, and he delivered them out of their troubles. He then led them by a straight way to go to a city where he could live. Now remember, Hagar and Ishmael, they were in that same situation. They're out in the desert, couldn't find a place where water. She cries out, and God led them directly to a place where they could drink water. Okay, there's a crying out. Verse 8, let them praise Adonai for his mercy and his wonders for the children of men. So according to the rabbis, they determined that after saving someone from a long journey, they would offer a Shalomim or Thanksgiving offering. So this would be almost like a must. Hey, I was going to die in the desert, and God saved me and got me to the city. The first thing I'm going to do is bring a Shalomim offering. Okay. Two more. Verse 10. Now, this is the second way. Some sat, verse 10, 107. Some sat in the darkness and deep in gloom, prisoners in misery and iron chains. For they had defied, that's the reason why they're in prison. They had defied God's words and spurned the counsel of the Elyon. So he humbled their heart with trouble. They stumbled, and no one was helping. And remember, in the ancient days, when you went to prison, your family had to feed you or you would die. Okay. So they cried out to Adonai in their distress, and he delivered them out of their troubles. He brought them out of darkness and deep gloom, breaking their chains. And verse 15 says, let them praise Adonai for his mercy and his wonders. Same words for when somebody was out of a desert, mercy and wonders. For the children of men, for he shattered bronze gates and broke into pieces iron bars. So again, the rabbi said these verses that when God allows you to get out of prison, the first thing you would do is an opportunity to give a Shalomim offering. And I would submit to you guys, remember when Yeshua heals the 10 lepers? Only one went back and said, thank you. All right. I would believe that one also did a Thanksgiving offering, because he realized, look, he was in slavery to his disease for the rest of his life, and there was no salvation. But he was smart enough to say thank you to the person who healed him. And so this would be reasons for doing Thanksgiving offerings. Here would be the last one from Psalms 107. Some go out, says here, some go out into the sea in ships, doing business on the mighty waters. And they saw the works of Adonai and his wonders in the deep, for he spoke and raised a stormy wind, lifting up towering waves. They mounted up to the sky and plunged down to the depths. And in their peril, their souls melted away. They reeled and staggered like a drunk, and all their skill was bewildered. So they cried out. Notice again, they cried out to Adonai in their distress, and he brought them out of their troubles. He gave them mercy. Okay. So, and again, the rabbis posited again that the severe danger of storms on the water are clear indication that Yahweh's power would be saving them from this storm. Okay. Now, why I bring up these three is because the rabbis say these are the three reasons that almost a requirement to bring a Thanksgiving offering. Okay. And there's many other reasons, but these would be three that are noticeable in scripture. Notice Jonah understands this. Now, this psalm is probably written around the time of David or Solomon. Okay. And I'm not sure who, but it would probably around 1000 BC. 300 years later, notice the words of Jonah. Okay. Jonah, chapter 1, verse 4. For you hurled me from the deep into the heart of the seas, and currents swirled around me. All your waves and your breakers swept over me. And I said, I have been banished from before your eyes. Yet I will continue to look towards your holy temple. This statement here is a statement of repentance. Waters surround me up to my soul. The deep sea engulfed me. Reeds clung to my head. To the bottoms of the mountains I went down. The earth with her bars was around me forever. Yet you brought my life up from the pit. That word there, pit, is Sheol. Adonai, my God. As my soul was fading from me, I remembered Adonai, and my prayer came to you toward your holy temple. Notice where it was directed. Those who watch worthless, empty things forsake their mercy, but I, with a voice of thanks, will sacrifice to you what I vowed I will pay. Notice that he's saying that I will give a Shalomim offering because salvation is from Adonai. Yeshua is from Adonai. You guys see that? So here's 300 years later after the Psalm. It was clearly understood that something like this would bring salvation. Okay, we're almost done here. So here's kind of some final thoughts on these offerings. The pagan nations use these sacrifices, both the burnt and peace offerings, for divination. Divination is associated with the animal sacrifice, and the purpose was foretelling of the future. In many cases, the well-being, albeit like long journeys, if we go on this journey, will the entrails tell us that we'll be saved? Or if we're going into war or other situations. So that's what divination is used in these Shalomim offerings, okay, that they would offer their gods. And they would use the entrails as part of this process. So this is where God prohibited it and made it clear specifically in the Shalomim offerings. He says, Leviticus 3:9, from the sacrifice of a fellowship offerings, he would bring a gift made by fire to Adonai. Its fat, the entire tail that we cut away close to the backbone, along with the fat that covers the innards, and all the fat that's on the entrails, as well as the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is over them, which is by the loins, plus the cover on the liver that he is to remove from the kidney. So the kidneys are this, it's considered unclean. So if anybody does eat this, keep this in mind. This is very unkosher to eat the kidneys as well as the entrails. I know in other countries, I remember in Ecuador, there was a delicacy soup was to eat the entrails of a pig. It's disgusting, but this was part of the nation's what they do. Now notice here, verse 11, the Cohen is to burn it up as smoke on the altar. What is he burning up? The fat, kidneys, the entrails, and they don't even let it, they take it directly onto it, and it's burned up as a holy aroma to the Lord, and no divination is involved in this. And this is brought out specifically, this is brought out in this offering because it's this offering that the pagan nations would use to do divination with. Okay.
How about the liver?
So only a part of the liver, okay? Plus the cover on the liver and I got some specific instruction. If in Jacob Milgram, he tells you what part of the liver you can eat, but most of it you can't. Most of it you can't. It's unclean.
I think it's a smaller part. Is a smaller one?
Yes.
Big, and then there's a small one.
All right. So, okay, we've finished there. Any questions on what we've covered today? I know you're all tired. I'm sorry. That went kind of long. I'll go ahead and stop the recording.
And for me, I came in late.
Yeah, I'm noticing